Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Before we get started with today's episode of our podcast, we would like to present to you a sample of the songs that our esteemed guest, Mr. Jess Munoz, is going to be talking to us about today. This is the song that gives this album its title. It's called Visca l'amor, and this particular song was written and composed in 1936 as part of a set of songs called La Rosa al la Vis, The Rose on the Lips, by Edouard Toldrat.
Visca l'amor che va donat l'amica, fresca e pulita come un maig content. Visca l'amor, e gridata e mania, vatela blanda come un glocchegliet. Visca l'amor che va donat l'amica fresca e pulita come un maig content. Visca l'amor che va donat l'amica che io da me stelia. Visca l'amor. L'amor io le prest.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. My name is Morgan Lewin. I am one of the moderators over at Ask Historians, writing under the username Aquatermain, and I am a historical musicologist. Joining me today is Dr. Jess Munoz. Dr. Munoz is a classically and operatically trained lyrical tenor. He currently serves as professor of voice and opera at the University of Delaware and is the president-elect of the National Opera Association of the United States. He is also a recipient of the National Foundation for Advancement in the Arts Career Grant for contributions to the dissemination of Iberian and Latin American art song. For his ongoing creative activities in interdisciplinary performances and pedagogy, he has been recognized by the National Opera Association, the National Association of Teachers of Singing, the American Prize, the Delaware Division of the Arts, and others. As a singer, he has performed with the Israel Philharmonic, the New York Philharmonic, the Los Angeles Philharmonic, the American Symphony Orchestra, and at the Mostly Mozart Festival in the Lincoln Center, with the Voices of Ascension Chorus in New York, at the Verviers Festival in Switzerland, at the Bard Music Festival, at the New York City Opera, and at the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater on Broadway. Welcome, Jess.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you so much for joining us. And today, Jess and Dr. Munoz is going to be talking to us about the Catalan art song, which is something that we don't usually think about and we don't usually consider as even part of the art song movement in Europe in general. So the first thing I would like to ask you is why the Catalan art song? How did you discover this particular repertoire?
Well, how I discovered it dates back to my years as a student at Stony Brook University when I was attaining my doctoral degree. When I was an undergraduate student, I rarely had the opportunity to engage in music of my heritage. Most of the repertoire that's covered in conservatories of music these days focuses on Central European song literature. And when we use that term, we're basically discussing German literature, French and Italian vocal literature, Spanish, Castellano. It's often excluded. And so it was of great interest to me to be able to study uh, Spanish, Latinx, Hispanic vocal literature more. And so I had received a grant in 2009 to do some exploratory research in Spain. And at the time, I was really just expecting to arrive there and to focus on some of the literature that was more recognized here in the States, music by Manuel de Falla, Obradors, Fernando Obradors, uh, this typical song literature that we would definitely consider to be quite Spanish, right? That has that torero fire or that flamenco feel to it. And I was quite surprised when I visited the Biblioteca de Catalunya, the library in Barcelona, and came across all of this Catalan song literature. They house the archives of Manuel de Falla there and of a soprano by the name of Conchita Badia, who had premiered a lot of song literature written by Catalonian composers. And just for your audience to know, Catalunya or Catalonia is the autonomous community in Spain where the repressive effects of the Spanish Civil War and Francisco Franco's dictatorial ban on its native language, Catalan, contributed to scarce diffusion of all of its literature abroad, which included its canon of classical song or classical art songs. And so, really, general public knowledge of this art song um, is not very well known. What we do know come from some extant recordings of a few internationally uh, revered, I would say, native composers. Some of you may know the name Victoria de los Angeles, Montserrat Caballé, Jose Carreras, of course, one of the three tenors. These are all native Catalonians, and they they did some wonderful work in championing what I would call the endangered music of their homeland. But really, still much work remains in order to achieve a deeper understanding of this music. And so when I went to Spain and I found all of this repertoire, some repertoire inside of the archives that had never been published, I just thought, wow, I mean, it would be incredible to be able to disseminate or serve as a conduit through which this repertoire could be more widely disseminated in North America. And so I started looking at the repertoire more in depth and identifying some of that literature that could work well with my voice. I'm a tenor, and and I found quite a bit. As a matter of fact, it became a bit of a challenge for me to decide what repertoire I would want to program for a concert or for a recital. And I'm very happy and pleased to share that just this past January, 2021, we released a new album, part of this long time research of Catalan art song, entitled Visca l'amor, translated to Long Live Love. The title is Visca l'amor, Catalan art songs of the 20th, 21st centuries. And really, our goal is to illuminate this nationalistic genre of Catalan art song, to illuminate its history, its style, and to provide a context for understanding the performance practice so that ultimately Catalan art song of the 20th and 21st centuries may continue to gain recognition.
I think that's a fascinating and the very worthy endeavor. One of the things that Ask Historians as a public history project is designed for, and one of the core parts of our mission and our vision, has to do precisely with amplifying these underrepresented and minoritized voices in history. And when it comes to analyzing Francisco Franco's dictatorial regime in general, we tend to see it as a broader national situation, and we usually just kind of forget about just how difficult things were for the people of Catalonia, and also for the people of the Basque country. So I think it's an excellent idea to try and bring these beautiful songs, because you very generously share these recordings with me, and they are just absolutely fantastic. And even for me, and for people who have already listened to our podcast for a while, you probably know that I'm from Argentina. I don't speak Catalan. I have no idea how to speak Catalan. It is a very different language from Spanish. Um, so I think that that's also something that I would very much like to ask you, because you are very fluent in Spanish. But as far as I understand it, you are not fluent in Catalan. So what were the challenges for you when it came to being able to sing a language that is even within the classical music world and the art song world, a language that doesn't really play a part, a language that isn't used, a language that isn't like, I don't know, we are used to hearing Montserrat Caballé, which you mentioned, singing in Spanish and in Italian and in French and in German, not even in her own native language in Catalan. We're not used to that. So what was it like for you? How was this process?
Oh, it was an incredible process. I will say that Catalan holds similarities of vocabulary and grammar to Spanish, also similarities to Italian and French. So, being conversational in Italian and French, and of course, being a fluent Spanish speaker, I came in with an amount of knowledge and ammunition that could help me to enter into the understanding of this language. But it's very important to understand and to recognize that the Catalan language is indeed a language in its own right, um, evolved directly from Latin. It's not a dialect, it's not a regionalism, it is a language in its own right. And so perhaps the main challenge for any non native speaker of the language, because I'm a non-native speaker, is to interpret this repertoire um, with finesse, of course. And one of the challenges in interpreting the repertoire is that singing diction pedagogues have yet to provide sufficient guidelines that can specifically address what we call the sung application of the Catalan language. And so, to give a little bit of history of this for our listeners, when a classical singer goes to a conservatory to study voice performance, they're not just learning how to sing, they take courses related to how to be able to properly enunciate the languages that they are singing. Because in order for us to be able to sing not simply pop music, but classical music that demands that you sing in an unamplified manner, the way in which you're utilizing the articulators inside your mouth, right? Your tongue, how unhinged your jaw is when you're speaking, all of these things, they are somewhat adjusted from how we speak in the vernacular in order for you to be able to sing in an amplified manner. And so there are a plethora of texts out there today to help train singers in how to be able to enunciate in sung application when a language is sung, in languages such as French and Italian and German. But there is no textbook that yet exists for the Catalan language. So certainly providing a phonetic breakdown of the language using the International Phonetic Alphabet, known as IPA, so that non-native singers may be able to interpret with the requisite finesse, is certainly a vital step towards making the repertoire globally accessible. And so I would just say that as scholars work to provide clearer codifications and greater resources, if there are any singers that are listening or just any avocational singers interested in picking up this repertoire, I would encourage them to refer to proper dictionaries and to listen to a variety of native and professional singers who studied the language in depth. As your ear becomes more attuned to the nuances of the language, then you'll find that it is quite a singable language. It has, again, many distinctives, similar distinctives that have really termed Italian and French as very singable languages. These are all languages that are very fluid, that have some wonderful vowels that are easy to sing in. Um, and so, yes, it's been a joy to be able to engage in this fascinating language, and its relationship to all of these other languages.
I think that one of the fascinating things about this project in general is this idea that music pedagogy and that music history need to start. Um, I'm trying to be delicate here, but they just need to stop being as traditionally elitist as they've usually been. Again, when we think about art song in general, when we think about lyrical singing in general, it is very much usually just tied to the same three or four languages, the same three or four composition styles and libretto writing styles. And these particular songs, they are just delightful, but they are also very powerfully charged with a lot of emotional symbolism. The lyrics to these songs are just powerful. They are designed to get to you on a fundamental level, and to transmit. I mean, the very title of the album, Visca l'amor, is this, and it comes from one of the songs actually from Edward Toldra, and it's difficult for me to articulate as a music historian. It's difficult for me to articulate just how important it is for us, for the listeners and for the performers and for the pedagogues and the historians, for everyone involved in the situation, to understand that there is always a human element behind the construction of these songs and of these lyrics. There is always a human being and a human context, the society around them. We were mentioning earlier the presence of Francisco Franco, del generalísimo, el caudillo de España, Spain's dictator for decades. Franco was the dictator of Spain from 1936 until 1975, one of the longest reigning dictatorships in recent history. Um, and to have an entire generation being denied their history, being denied their culture, their everything that has to do with their national identity. Because, as you very well said, Catalan is a language. Catalan is not a dialect. Catalan is a language that belongs to a nation, to the Catalonian people who think of themselves and see themselves as an independent nation from Spain. So I think that it's just excellent that you decided to go ahead with this particular project when you were researching. And I wanted to ask you about the composers themselves. Why did you choose these particular composers? Because we have Eduard Toldra, we have Ricard Lamotte, Narcís Bonet, Frédéric Monpeau, and Joan Comedas, and we also have an actual contemporary composer who is Elisenda Fábregas. So how did you come about deciding on these specific people and this particular repertoire?
Yes, well, first of all, I just want to acknowledge my appreciation for your emphasis on the stories behind, the narratives behind, the history behind this song literature, the why, because ultimately it's the holistic picture of this body of repertoire that really interested me. The title of our album, the title of our project, uh, is Visca l'amor, long live love. but I often have to clarify to people that this title, Long Live Love, Visca l'Amor, it's not simply pointing to romance. Although the melodies contained on the disc are very beautiful and the poetry itself often points to physical desire, this is not a Valentine's Day album. More importantly, the project, as I see it, and bringing us back to these composers that are featured, these composers we've identified, uh, they're all documenting something more than romance. They're documenting the cry for love of country, the cry for their culture, for fraternal affection, for national identity. It's really a yearning that is explored through musical and poetic colors. And I, as I've taken time to reflect on the music, what I've come to realize is that it's it's all emerging from the human compulsions to look and to record, uh, to contemplate. And often we were contemplating while we're mourning, right? And in the case of these composers, I would say that much like the civil unrest, the physical displacement that many of these Catalonian artists faced, um, we know that troubled times are inherent in many compelling human stories. Specifically, the frustration of seeing one's hopes halted, of one's hard work not fully realized. But what I found incredibly powerful about each of these composers highlighted in our disc is that they were creating in a way where they were attempting to break free from the constraints of their present state. They were working, I would say, to draw on what they were experiencing, to gain understanding of what lay perhaps beyond what they knew in their present state, right? And they were very vocal about it, that they were working to make peace, to make a positive difference. And so I find that performing and sharing these pieces in a way makes me an active participant in their noble legacy, in the legacy that these composers left us. Even here in the United States, quite recently, this topic of democracy and democracy's fragility, right? A heightened awareness in the last few years, on the fragility of democracy, how fascism can still be an ever-present danger. These are conversations that we're having yet still today. So my hope is that the narrative of Catalonia, that the narrative of these composers can remind us all to walk humbly and certainly to walk with care.
I think that's a fascinating perspective because, especially as you very well said, both in the U.S. and in general in the world, at a time in which we are seeing a rise in certain political ideologies that we, at least me personally, as an historian, I would have thought we would have learned something by now about the dangers of fascism and far right extremism in general, fundamentalism. Um, it's always something that, again, as a music historian, and as a music historian who specializes in the human component behind music, not just the technical aspects of it. This idea that the political landscape shapes, for better or worse, the way in which a nation and a people produce culture, produce art. It's it's always necessary for us to be able to keep these things in mind, to understand that there are real struggles, historical and also very current struggles behind the reality and the contextual situation of many of these songs and these cultural forms of artistic representation. I mean, we are talking about the Catalan language, we are talking about the people from Catalonia, a part of the world that is still very much fighting for their independence today, every day. The part of the world and a part of Europe that still every year on and on they have huge, massive demonstrations protesting against the Spanish government and against what they consider to be Spanish occupation of their territories. Um, it is very easy for those of us, both in academia and outside of it, to consider and to think of certain subaltern or underrepresented nations in the world, but it's always very hard to see at a European country and think that something like this is happening in Europe. We usually have like this perfect idealized version of Europe in general as a continent. So I think that it's very interesting that that you are trying to bring to the light these composers who are telling us these stories. Like you very well said, this isn't just about romantic love. This is about emotion, human emotion.
Well, and it's also about the censorship, right?
Hmm.
Because one thing is to tell people, well, you can no longer speak your tongue, or your tongue is no longer going to be recognized as an official language, uh, in where you live, right? But this went so much further, to the point where the publishing, the recording industries, uh, during this period of time, 1936 all the way up until 1975, they were practically decimated, right? And that's why we know so little about this language and about Catalan culture. Um, but one of the great things is that, yes, as you've mentioned, right, the Catalonian people, they have arisen and they were able to recover their autonomous status once again, and in that, um, local publishers, they've begun to recover the countless works of neglected composers of the past century. But many works are still out of print. Um, and I'll say that still today several unpublished manuscripts remain enshrouded in the library and estate archives, such as what I witnessed years back. Um, but but of course, this is something that we applaud, and to see that the resources are emerging, and that a time is now arising, where we're prepared to disseminate and celebrate the literature. That's a powerful and beautiful thing.
I think it's a very powerful message, and this question is more for myself than for anyone else. Uh, for this particular album, you selected four different poems by Bartolomé Rousseau Porcel, and you commissioned one of the greatest living Spanish composers, Elisenda Fábregas, to put them into music. What was this collaboration like with such a magnificent composer as Fábregas is?
Oh, well, I really again appreciate you noting Fabregas as one of the great living Catalonian composers. I would say she's just one of the great living composers, period.
Yeah.
Um, it was really it was really important for us to not only pay tribute to the music of the past, but also to celebrate the work of the living Catalonian composers who today are producing incredibly powerful works of art. And Elisenda Fabregas is such an artist. And what we really love about working with her is that she also understands how to set the language to music in a way that considers the necessities of the human voice. So, for example, early in the collaborative process, she asked what I felt that my strengths were as a singer, and where my voice liked to sit best. Right, what was my range? How high I could sing, how low I could sing, and so it was very clear even in her first drafts that she was working to align her ideas with ours, that ultimately gave birth to a brand new song cycle, a cycle of 4 songs, um, named Imitación del Foc, or Imitation of Fire, as translated. And we really feel that it's a compelling and very important song cycle. And as you mentioned, it's based on a series of poems by Bartomeu Rosselló Porcel, who was a Spanish Balearic poet who wrote in Mallorcan, which was a dialect of the Catalan language. And I would just like to just say that, um, back to the Catalan language, right, so far they've identified 18 regional dialects for this language, of which Mallorcan is one of them. And so, really, it's just turned out to be a joy to be able to study more in depth one of the dialects of the Catalan language, and to do that with Elisenda, who does such an incredible job at really bringing out the influences of Rosselló Porcel and how he would set poetry. He comes from the generation of the Spanish avant-garde, specifically the Surrealist school. And yes, his poetry, it utilizes the symbolic presence of fire and related words such as flame and ash, as metaphors of purification, change, mystery. And again, he, alongside other poets of the day, they were using this poetry to to serve as a metaphor for overarching themes of nationalism as well, undoubtedly. And there were moments where they were quite vocal about that. And so, there's just a lot of depth to to his work.
I think that this particular poet is very interesting because he died very young. For the people in the audience, Bartomeu Rosselló Porcel died when he was 25 years old, and most of his work is so it's so powerfully intertwined in this, in, as you say, in this nationalistic narrative, but also in a deeply emotional and deeply personal way of conveying his national feelings. That to a degree, sometimes it reminds me of the way Lily Boulanger used to write her music in France. But it's interesting because I've heard a couple of musicalizations of his poems by another wonderful Catalonian composer, Maria del Mar Bonet. But her music is very different from the kind of music Fabregas composes. So I think I felt like it was a very interesting way of portraying the identity of this individual in the way these songs are are written and performed. And again, I believe that to everyone in the audience, you should definitely get this album, this recording. It's absolutely fantastic in every possible sense of the way. But since we are in the topic of these collaborations, I also wanted to ask you about your wife, who is also the pianist in this recording, Oksana sorry if I'm pronouncing this wrong, because I'm half Jewish, but I'm very bad at Jewish names.
Oksana Glauchko.
Gloucester. Uh-huh. There we go. So When I was listening to these recordings, I couldn't help but go back in my mind to that very famous recording of Der König by Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau. For those of us in the audience who may not know this, Der König is a song written by Schubert, by Franz Schubert. It's a deeply powerful song, but it very much depends both on the singer and in the piano not being a mere uh, companion to the singer, but interacting constantly with it. And by listening to these recordings, I could hear the way in which the two of you, were actually interacting. You weren't just going side by side; you were intertwining your sounds. So I also wanted to ask you about this particular collaboration.
Yes, well, thanks for asking. Well, the Oksana and I are married. This is it makes for a very special collaboration. It's also incidental in the sense that Oksana and I first met as musical colleagues in New York City, where we were both active performers with our own careers. And I would just say that I noted back then that her talent was a very special one in the sense that she's not only an impeccable technician who plays clean and clear, but she's what we would call a colorist, a pianist who's ever interested in the nuances within each musical phrase. And really, her zeal for honoring what's on the written page, what the composer wrote, is also something that I greatly admire about this collaboration with her, and that has really through the years grown me as a musician. And it sounds like a relatively easy thing to achieve, to play simply what's written in the musical score, but it's actually I find it to be a far more difficult skill to master, even among some musicians of great renown. Um, and Oksana she's first a solo pianist who some might identify as a child prodigy. She had won a lot of competitions in her youth, including the Claudio Arrau International Piano Competition. And then with the end of the Cold War, her family immigrated to Tel Aviv, where she was able to work with the likes of Natasha Tatzon, Victor Derevianko, who was a pupil of Heinrich Neuhaus, who was a prolific pedagogue who nurtured artists such as Radu Lupu, Sviatoslav Richter, Emil Gilels, which some of your listeners may know. Um, and so later here in the States, she was mentored by Gilbert Kalish, who's an active mover and shaker of the Chamber Music Society at Lincoln Center. So it's really this legacy of sound and integrity of playing that that Oksana then brings into collaboration with others. So we're really fortunate to be able to couple our personal experiences, and now that we're married, it's hard for her to turn down my offers to at least a few recitals annually. So on average, we perform between 8 to 12 times together each season. But one thing that I want to say is that one of the things that brings us great joy when studying the music of Catalan song literature is that it really is not just a showcase for the voice, but it is also a showcase for the piano, and part of that has to do with really the history of how this repertoire in the 20th and 21st century was rolled out. Often people when they ask me about this music and in relation to their unfamiliarity of the repertoire, they often ask, "Well, what is the music most akin to?" Um, are there any relationships with other repertoire that I might be more familiar with? And one of the things, I basically start off by telling them that Catalan art song certainly has its own distinctive musical voice and heritage. Um, and as we've shed light on, of course, it epitomized nationalist sentiment. Um, but uh, but we need to recognize that many of these composers ended up fleeing Catalonia and Spain because of the repressive effects of the Franco dictatorship. And so they went to neighboring countries to study and to write. To Germany, to Italy, but many of them actually ended up in France. And so their style became an amalgamation of that ancient Catalonian folklore, but also with foreign stylistic influences. And what we find is that their original melodies are mostly underscored and strongly influenced by this exchange of ideas on Impressionism and on neoclassicism with France. And then you also find that miniaturist and other modern European avant-garde techniques are also seen. So, for example, in the case of one of the composers featured on this disc, Frederic Monpeau, who lived for many years in Paris, contrary to Spanish generalizations that Spanish art song demands a constant fan waving or some kind of torero fire. What we find is the construction of his pieces are more economical, but they're rich at the same time in abstract harmonies that really serve to fulfill his musical vision, which he was very verbal about. He would say, this is music that's more provocative. It's more intimate, and it's filled with sublime moments of tonal ambiguity. So, with that said, it's important to note that the piano parts are highly sophisticated, often chamber-like in scope. It demands a pianist who's also a colorist, who can bring out those impressionist influences of composers like Debussy and Ravel and Satie. And so it's a joy for us to be able to connect the dots for our listeners when it comes to that aspect of the repertoire.
I think that that's a very interesting point to make because, again, when we think about Iberia or Spain as a general region and in art music, we think about Sarasate, we think about Manuel de Falla, Joaquin Rodrigo, Francisco Tárrega, the greatest Spanish composers. But they were usually very Spanish, very much Spanish. They usually, as you said, that they usually had this fire. Uh, even in Sarasate, who was more actually interested in Romani and Gypsy music than in Spanish music, there is always this particular fire, this energy, this tendency to go towards gigantic ensembles, or when it comes to smaller pieces for less instruments, they are still very much designed to be impressive. They usually echo the zarzuelas of all. For those in the audience who may not know, a zarzuela is basically the Spanish opera. The zarzuela is the dramatization of lyrical singing in Spain and in Spanish history. But these people, these particular composers, like you said, they have this impressionistic style and this impressionistic emotion to them. That's why I was referring also earlier to Lydie Boulanger, um, because there's this very deep emotional component that is usually transmitted by by a concept, by a very simple concept. Sometimes less is more. Sometimes you don't actually need to have an entire symphonic orchestra playing in the background for you to be able to transmit these emotions. These people are capable, and the arrangements that you've used are also capable of transmitting with the two of you so much more than we can sometimes hear in larger, way more bombastic productions. Um, which is something that it's also very interesting, because when we look at impressionistic music in general, it is very easy to stay in France. It is very easy for us to always go back to the French composers, even though most of them didn't actually like to be called impressionists. Uh, but to see this particular influence going forward and spreading outside of Paris and France in general, because there is also a region in France that used to be part of Catalonia.
Yes. Um, the Pyrenees Oriental region was part of Catalonia, and actually, the Catalan language is spoken by 9.5 million people on the face of the earth, approximately 9.5 million, which covers also a region in Sardinia, Italy, Alghero, and uh, and uh, and other regions of the world. And so, yes, it's not just on the mainland of Catalonia. And so, hence those regional dialects that we see moving throughout. And I'll say that when it comes to the sung application of the language, um, just like singers would utilize what's called Hochdeutsch or High German, uh, which uh, which you encounter in Berlin uh, for sung application. Here, when it comes to Catalan, at least informally, it's the central dialect that's most used for art song literature, which is the Catalan that you would hear primarily in Barcelona, with some Valencian influence as well, which is the Catalan that you would hear in public discourse. So, you know, on the news through telecasts and whatnot, and that's what we mostly utilize on this album. And it's actually interesting because um, when we were working on the Mallorcan poetry, that was an area of discussion that we talked a lot about. Do we want to pronounce this text with the Mallorcan dialect, or do we want to go ahead and use the central dialect of Barcelona? In the end, we decided, just for the uniformity of the album, to go ahead and do it all in that central dialect. But it would be interesting, maybe, who knows, 10 years from now, to re record the piece or whatnot on another album utilizing that Mallorcan dialect. I think it would be really colorful and fun. But the primary focus was for us to begin disseminating this repertoire, its rich culture, its rich history. And for your listeners, anyone who wants to learn more on the project, you can visit our website, jessmunoz.com, JESSMUNOZ.com. And the album is now available on all major platforms, including iTunes, Spotify, Pandora, or you could also visit bridgerecords.com, who I also want to applaud for their incredible support of the dissemination of underrepresented song literature and underrepresented music. We really have to applaud our independent labels that are really more than ever doing a wonderful job at championing the marginalized music of nations around the globe.
Well, I think that this has been one of the most interesting podcast episodes I've ever done. It's usually the Ask Historians podcast, as I was telling you before we started recording. We usually have, well, we usually have historians, and to have someone who comes from a different part of the academic musical world to bring us your perspective, I think that it's very useful. It's very important. Um, Because again, we are talking about a very heavily underrepresented part of the art song movement in general. Um, and there's before we go, there's one small question I would like to ask you. That it has to do with this idea that, as you were saying at the beginning of the episode, most of the songs that have been recorded of the Catalonian art songs that have been recorded so far have been recorded by female singers, by singers like Victoria Los Angeles and Montserrat Caballé. What do you believe does the tenor voice bring to the table when it comes to recording these songs?
Well, I think first and foremost, just greater accessibility, because as you just shared, oddly, there's this prevailing misconception that Catalan art songs, and I'll just say that Spanish art song at large, um, uh, is better suited to treble voices, right? The soprano voice, to the mezzo voice. And so only a handful of Catalan art song recordings feature lower voice classifications, such as tenor or baritone. And I thought that was interesting because the majority of the poets are men, and so much of the poetry is coming from that male perspective, and so I always thought that that was interesting. But part of the reason for that actually is because of Conchita Badilla, this soprano that I had mentioned earlier, she was the superstar of the era, and most of these composers wrote for her, and so she premiered a lot of these major works, and yet the poetry is coming from that male perspective. So I thought this was interesting. So it's our hope that our recent recording can help to demystify how and by whom this music can be interpreted. And I'm really pleased to share that. There's a variety of repertoire within the genre suitable for all voice classifications and certainly artistic temperaments. So that's been a real fun thing to be able to explore on this project for sure.
Well, so I think that that's probably gonna be it for this particular episode. And before we go, the project and the album is called Visca l'Amor, Catalan Art Songs of the 20th and 21st Centuries. And thank you so much, muchísimas gracias, Jess, for joining me today. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Muchas gracias. Ha sido un placer. It's also been a pleasure for me. And I just say to all of your listeners, we continue to live through all pandemics, all kinds of pandemics happening in the world today. And I want to encourage all of you to, whatever your narrative or your story is, keep singing on your journey.
And now, to play us out, let's listen to another one of the songs from the album. In this particular case, the song is called Ardent Hymn, and it's part of a song cycle called Imitació del Foc, Imitation of Fire, based on four poems written by Spanish Balearic poet Bartomeu Rosselló Porcel and composed by commission from Dr. Munoz by one of the most important living composers in Catalonia, Elisenda Fàbregas.
Aquestes són les hores de sols velocíssims. I ara cavalquen uns homes de llargues cavalieres per damunt les escales del vent, cavalls de sang. Reflexos de l'incendi arriben a les nits que bateguen de foc, caran per diamants cremats, arena, cendra, caran per diamants cremats. arena sembra. Per les zones ruens del paradís volen damunt les flames atuades homes o nostres llargues cavalleres combaten amb l'espasa del vent i de la llum. Amazanats, llargues cavalleros, combaten amb l'espasa del vent i de la llum.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.